what my concern is in this conversation is that we don't try and recreate something, that we look at something from the access that we have to it now. So in this case, the value for you of the oral tradition is not that you join up or do a Google search or anything like that, because it's ridiculous. But on the other hand, I have received a lot of this knowledge from inside of an oral tradition. The way that I know things, the way I understand things, the way I perform things are very largely informed from the oral tradition that I've been part of for the last 45 years. So this is a little advantage. What kind of advantage? It's an advantage because I am not going to tell you what you read in books and what is normally what is said on, for example, the lecture circuit. I'm coming from a different place. This is why people think of me often as contrarian. I'm not purposely contrarian. It's just that I've had a different angle, a different approach to a lot of the similar subject matter, and therefore I have a slightly different take on a lot of these issues. So the fact that you get exposed to a slightly different take, another angle, an angle that's not normally available, gives you the possibility or potential to broaden the horizons a little bit and extend the possibilities a little bit. It gives you the possibility to attempt to think certain things that may not have occurred to you before. Okay.
Om Namo Narayan.
Om Namo Narayan. I hear Yamunagiri.
Om Namo Narayan. I was going to say something on Jennifer's point of how do you get the authority of our tradition in the modern times? How can you rely on the truth being transmitted? So I was trying to say, but on this little iPhone toy, it didn't. I don't come on my sound. Okay, so the oral tradition, hey, it's alive. It's alive. It's living in Yog, which means in connection with truth. Satchit Ananda is the consciousness of truth and the bliss in it. So this is alive, and this is transmitted from guru to disciple as a living oral tradition. And authority derives from experience. Om Namo Narayan.
Om Namo Narayan.
Om Namo Narayan.
Thank you, Yamunagiri. The oral tradition is not something that you're going to join. It's not something to believe in. There is no doctrine of the oral tradition. It is it's a way of culture. It's a way of culture that used to be the major way of culture, the major way that that knowledge was passed down, that information was passed down. In the last several hundred years, that has changed, and our concept of authority changes along with the concept of an oral tradition. Whereas hundreds of years ago, if there was a dispute about a particular word, even if there were dictionaries in existence, still you might go to your grandfather or your grandmother or a wise man, a wise elder in the town that would know these kinds of things because he would have the authority, and that's how you would find out about the word. And how does he have the authority? Well, how does he have this knowledge? Well, it came down to him also from mouth to ear, from people who he attributed authority to, probably his father, grandfather, something like this. So the oral tradition is not an option out there. And also, I would say that the oral tradition is not just based on hearing somebody say something orally. I mean, that has actually very little to do with it. We have a literate tradition, and yet people talk all the time, and we get information all the time from people speaking. Yet it's not that when we hear something from somebody's mouth, it's suddenly the oral tradition, and when we read something, it's a literate tradition. It's a whole mode of culture. Oral tradition still exists to a small degree in the West. We could see it, for example, in Michelle's recipes from her grandmother. We can see it much more commonly in music. When I was a kid, the kids would get together and learn how to play their instruments, and you would learn from each other, and then if you went on as a musician, you played music with somebody who was better than you, and you learned from that, and you gained information and knowledge from listening, from going to concerts, or sitting in or listening to other musicians and talking to other musicians. But you couldn't think really of learning how to play rock and roll by reading a book. It just wouldn't make sense. If you could read musical notation, of course you could come up with some of the right notes, but you would never really get the you can never really become a musician solely on that basis. You'd have to be with somebody who was with somebody when they were younger, and there's a whole long tradition of passing down musical idioms. So it does exist. It doesn't exist very strongly. In India, up until recently, I think it was very strong. But I can tell you a little story that illustrates what's really happened in India. This must have happened, I guess the mid-80s, maybe in the mid-80s. I was sitting with my Guruji, Kapil Puriji Maharaj, and with one of my Guru Bhais, who later became a Mahamandaleshwar. And it might have been me who asked to hear my Guru's opinion on the date of the birth of Adi Shankaracharya. Now this is a very disputed moment. If you read the Western academics, I think almost without exception, everybody agrees that he was born in, I think the year that they assign is 780 AD, or at least sometime in the 8th century AD. But if you ask traditional people, I don't know how many anymore, but certainly when I was much younger, if you asked traditional people, they would tell you that he was born in the 5th century BC. Now, considering that Adi Shankara is undoubtedly India's foremost commentator on sacred texts, one of India's greatest reformers, arguably India's greatest philosopher, to have a dispute of what is that, 1400 years in terms of the date of his birth. I mean, this is really major. We're not talking about 50 or 100 years here, 1400 years. So I was interested in hearing Guruji's angle on this, but my Guru Bhai, who at that time was studying in the Sanskrit college in Benares, in Varanasi, he decided to make his comment, which was that indeed Adi Shankaracharya was born in the 8th century AD and not the 5th century BC. Why? Because scholars and academics for 100 years had gone over all of Adi Shankara's texts. They had gone over a number of other people's texts who had commented on Adi Shankara, referring either to him by name or referring to some situation that could be connected with Adi Shankaracharya. So in this way, if one looks for the references in Adi Shankaracharya's works, and one looks for the references in other people's works referring to Adi Shankara, one can start to get an idea of the time period. And so this is what they did. They put it together, all this information, and they came up with a conclusion that it must have been in the late 8th century. But Guruji, almost asking his disciple to wash his mouth out with soap, described Adi Shankara's family and Adi Shankara's guru and a couple gurus back. But then he named all the descendants, all the disciples and the disciples of disciples and so forth of Adi Shankaracharya, including the people who sat on the holy seat in Sringeri in the south, which was the first of the big monasteries that Adi Shankaracharya established. And he also named how many years each one of them reigned as on the throne of Sringeri, and he had somebody write everything down. And at the end of this description, which went on for hours, he had that person add up all the years, and added up, all the years came to about 2,500 years. So the issue here is not who is right. The issue here is that we get different results from looking at things in different ways. If we are going to be, for example, textually biased, and there are a lot of things that we can't account for when we look at texts, then we will conclude that indeed Adi Shankaracharya was born, or at least flourished, in the end of the 8th century AD. But if we are going to rely on more traditional sources, oral sources, then we're going to find a date much, much earlier than that. My interest is not to accept either, but to be aware that these are the possibilities. These are the various things that are out there. And I think that if we're aware of that, without making judgments that we're really not qualified to make, and there's no need to make these judgments either, but we're aware that it's not just one way, and one way does not have at least for me, doesn't have the total authority for ultimate truth, then I think we're okay.